One of my earliest memories was age of around 3 or 4, was of my mum catching me trying on a pair of my sister's knickers. And I remember when I did it, it felt so right. You know, I felt right.
I'm Sonya Morton Firth and you're tuned in to the Sonya Morton Firth Show. Today my guest is Katie Neeves. Katie is a trans ambassador, speaker, professional photographer and filmmaker. Watch this interview as we discuss all things sex and gender and what it's like to be a woman in a man's body. I believe health is the greatest form of wealth we have, which is why I'm so excited to be partnered with Brother in Arms. Brother in Arms is a wellness brand dedicated to working with veterans, first responders and anyone on the front line. Through their education, support and premium CBD products, they help alleviate and restore the lives of those that have been affected by physical and mental trauma. Learn about the life-changing benefits and power of CBD. Join their community today. Hit the link below. Katie, thank you so much for being a guest on my show today. It's lovely having you here in my home.
Oh, well, thanks for inviting me, Sonia. I don't get out much.
Katie, I've got, a multitude of questions to ask you today.
Okay.
But before we start, could you tell my audience who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so well, my name is Katie Neeves. I've been a professional photographer and filmmaker for the last 35 years, but 3.5 years ago I came out very publicly, very openly, very honestly as being transgender after living for 48 years as a man. So I now have a new business called Called to Be Trans, where I do trans awareness training and inspirational speaking. So I'm on a mission to do two things. One is to reach out to other trans people just to let them know that it's okay to be trans, because it really is okay to be trans. And so many trans people don't know that, and they put so much pressure on themselves, and they think the world's going to implode on them if they admit it to themselves, because nobody wants to admit it to themselves. And then the other thing is to reach out to everybody else and just show them that trans people are just ordinary people who want to be happy, and that's it. And that's the entire message, really.
Well, yeah. I know I've got so many questions to ask, but I think before we get into that, it'd be lovely to hear about your story and that sort of moment that you not decided. That's probably the wrong word.
Admitted it to myself.
Admitted it to yourself.
Yeah.
Can you take us back and take us through that story, that journey?
I think it's probably better to take you right back to the beginning. So I was born 52 years ago, and as is still the established custom, I was assigned as sex based purely on my primary sex characteristics.
Your genitals.
Yeah, exactly. What's between my legs?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing. And so, the doctor or midwife, looks between the legs, and they decide, depending on what they see, as to how they assign me. I was assigned male at birth. And I was given the name Martin Albert Neeves. Don't look like an Albert, do I?
No, I don't know. You don't look like Martin, actually.
Correct answer. Thank you, Sonia. Glad you said that. But the thing is, by the age of around 3 or 4, my head and my heart were telling me something very different to the label that I'd been given at birth.
That's such an interesting statement. I love it. What do you mean that your head and your heart? Tell me about that feeling. That's so.
It's just how I felt in myself. It's just, it's a job to describe. I think the best way I can describe it, and I'll go more into it as we go on. But are you left or right-handed?
I'm right-handed.
Can you?
Is it that I'm right-handed?
You held up your left hand then, Sonia. It's the other right hand.
But I've still got to do that. I'm terrible at knowing my left.
But can you write with your left hand?
No. Badly.
Yeah. But things that you could learn to write with it, but it wouldn't feel right, would it? I mean, I'm right-handed, but I could learn to write with my left hand, but it just wouldn't feel right. But you just know. It's just something that you just know, and that's how it is with your gender and in your gender identity. You just know, and so it's just the same with writing. And so for me, it was as if I'd been writing with my left hand for 48 years, but now I can write with my right hand. It's like that, really. But anyway, so one of my earliest memories was age of around 3 or 4, was of my mum catching me trying on a pair of my sister's knickers. And I remember when I did it, it felt so right. I felt right. But then my mum caught me and she told me off. and she told me to take them off. And for every day of the following week, she would pull my shorts down to check to make sure I was wearing my own pants. And it was humiliating, but it sowed the seeds for a very long time that what I was doing was wrong, it was dirty, it was naughty, it was not what respectable people did. But the thing is, however much my mum told me off or humiliated me about it, the urge and the need to cross-dress as it was then would always be with me. It was always there. And I don't blame my mum. It was the early 70s. It's just how things were.
Absolutely.
It's how things were then. So I don't blame her for that at all. It's just how things were.
And did you understand at that early age? Did you think you were doing something wrong because your mum was basically saying you're doing something wrong?
Yeah. Well, it was many years before I'd even admit to myself that what I was doing was cross-dressing. It's not what I did. It was just, I wouldn't admit it. I was in complete self-denial right up until my early 20s. In the mid-20s.
So you were cross-dressing all through your teenage
Oh yeah, absolutely.
years?
Yeah, I used to every opportunity I had. I used to secretly dress in my sister's clothes whenever I had the opportunity, and whenever I did it, it felt so right. But then those feelings of feeling right were very quickly replaced by feelings of guilt and shame and self-loathing because what I was doing was wrong. It was dirty. It was naughty.
It was
so I've been told
against
it was.
society.
Exactly. You've heard all the jokes. The jokes are still there about cross-dressers now. There's, they're all out there still, but it was worse back in the 70s. But it's still bad now. So, sort of carried on doing that, and then by my mid-20s, I trained to become trained to become a press photographer. And I was working on newspapers in Kent. I got married for the first time.
So you were married as well?
Yeah.
So was it just the cross-dressing that was the manifestation, or was there other feelings of being a woman that you had?
At that point, it was just that was really all I knew. It was just really that it felt right, cross-dressing. That's as it was then. But it was in my mid-20s so by the time after I got married and got a successful business and everything, so mid-20s, that's when I finally admitted to myself that I was then a cross-dresser. And as soon as I admitted it to myself, it was like a whole weight lifting off my shoulders, and I no longer felt guilty about it, and that felt amazing. And I realised I had a condition called gender dysphoria.
Dysphoria, not dysmorphia.
No, definitely not.
I've heard of body dysmorphia.
No, completely different thing. Yeah, gender dysphoria. Yeah, absolutely. It's a recognised medical term. And what that is a great feeling of unease and distress caused by a mismatch between how I felt in my head and my heart as opposed to my primary sex characteristics and the label that I'd been given at birth. And the thing about gender dysphoria is that it can vary in intensity and it very often increases over time. And that's exactly what happened with me. But at the time, the level of gender dysphoria that I had was low enough that it was satisfied by my occasional cross-dressing. So at the time, I was happy as a man who needed to cross-dress.
Did you tell your wife?
Not to begin with, I didn't know, because at that point, I hadn't admitted it to myself. As soon as I admitted it to myself, then I did, yeah. And she never accepted it, unfortunately. Although we stayed married for 13 years, amazingly. We should have split sooner because she never coped with it. We tried counselling many times, but unfortunately that didn't work. But during that 13 years, my photography business flourished, and I was working for many national newspapers and magazines, and so photos were regularly published in those, and photographed all sorts of notable people and events, so things like the 1990 poll tax riots in Trafalgar Square, Princess Diana's funeral, the Yugoslav Civil War, and also twice commissioned to photograph the Queen inside Buckingham Palace. So, I built up a lot of experience and a great reputation for myself over that time. But I say we should have split earlier than 13 years. But there was another thing, as well as the fact that my wife never accepted my cross-dressing, was that I wanted kids and she didn't. And I always thought that she would change her mind as she got older, as some women do. But unfortunately she didn't. And so as I was approaching, and earlier in our relationship and in our marriage, that wasn't so much of a problem because I was younger and it wasn't such a big deal for me. But as I was approaching 40, it was becoming a much much bigger, much more pressing issue for me. So there were two big things against this. And it's a shame because we loved each other and we were a great team together. But there's two things that we just couldn't get around. Because if we both wanted kids but couldn't have them, then there would be other options. There would be adoption and all sorts of different things.
But if one doesn't
But
want
if one doesn't want, there's nothing you can do. And so I decided to instigate my first divorce. And then while I was going through my first divorce, I then went on to meet a woman who would eventually become my second wife. I didn't want to get emotionally involved with anybody who couldn't accept that side of me. So I decided to tell her on the second date. Thought the first date was probably pushing it. So I told her on the second date. And to my surprise and to my delight, she was okay with it. But there were conditions attached. So she said, as long as I didn't do it more than once a week. But in those days I didn't, because the level of gender dysphoria that I had was low enough that cross-dressing once a week or longer than that was enough to satisfy it. So that was okay, that was a tick in the box. And then she said, as long as you never want to transition. Well, I absolutely didn't at the time, because the level of gender dysphoria was low enough. I was happy as a man who needed to cross-dress.
So there was no point, because it's fascinating that you felt, well, okay, I love women's clothes, I love dressing up in women's clothes, but I mean, did you feel comfortable around men?
I never felt I was one of the lads. Never,
yes, that's I
mean,
guess what I'm trying to get at. Did you like football? But
no, I didn't. No, I never liked football. I never liked any sport. I preferred to have music and photography as my main hobbies, and I had more friends who were girls than were boys, and but yeah, it was just one of the things. It's funny that like whenever I met other men, they invariably start talking about football, and who do you support then? No one. I'm not. I've never been into it at all.
And of course, there are men out there that just don't like sports, so you can't generalise.
Yeah. But so I never felt one of the lads. Okay. Never did. And I always preferred to have girly chats with my female friends. Always. And it's funny, several friends since now have said, "Oh, we always enjoyed having girly chats with you. We always felt you were more of one of the girls than a man." So it's really interesting that people have told me that since. But yeah. So anyway, so these conditions that we had. So, but then there was another condition which she said, if ever we were to have children, she didn't want them seeing it. And at the time, I thought, well, I didn't really agree to that, because I thought, well, I'd already lived a double life within my first marriage, and I didn't really want that with any children. I'd want them to know the real me. But then at the same time, I thought, well, let's face it, I'm fishing from a smaller pond here, aren't I? And I thought, well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. We might not even be able to have kids, so let's face the third one if and when it happens, you see. So our relationship blossomed, and 10 years ago we had a beautiful baby daughter who was the centre of my universe. But it was many years before we got around to getting married, because after the pain and the cost of my first divorce, I always said I'd never get married again. But eventually I weakened and I proposed. And we got married in August 2017.
And had your cross-dressing at this point escalated to more than once a week?
No, it was probably still about that. Sometimes I might have done it more, but and I did actually push the boundaries and go against my then girlfriend's wishes, and that I did show my daughter my cross-dressing, and I'm so glad I did now, because it made it.
Do you mind me asking, what was her reaction?
Well, she was fine, because she's grown up with it, you see. So
yes.
So
when you first showed her, was she a little girl?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's right from birth, really. So I just did it. I mean, my then girlfriend, now ex-wife, but was furious at the time, but I'm so glad that I did it now, because it's made it so much easier, because she's always seen that part. She's always known that part of me. Obviously, there's a difference between me being Katie once a week to being Katie all the time. That's the difference. And so that took a period of adjustment. But she always knew that side of me, and I'm so glad that I did that. But anyway, so we got married in August 2017. However, a few months before we got married, I just happened to meet a clairvoyant and a psychic healer, a spiritual healer, at a business networking meeting. Now,
what business meetings do you go to?
well,
I've never met a
well,
clairvoyant
exactly.
in a
That
business
is just the point. You don't do you? You meet people like accountants and financial advisors and utility warehouse discount club salespeople.
And you're looking at your watch thinking, this is really boring.
Nothing wrong with those people. So lots of my friends are in those professions, but clairvoyants are fascinating, aren't they? And so I was just intrigued by her, and I was talking to her for most of the evening. I didn't bother talking to anybody else, but I can talk to accountants any time. So I was fascinated by her, and then by the end of the evening, I thought, oh, I'm going to book up for a reading. I didn't feel the need for a reading or anything, but I was just intrigued. So I went along. I tell you what, Sonya, she blew me away. She was incredible. She said so many things that were so true, so pinpoint accurate, things that she couldn't have guessed or she couldn't have found out from my website or my social media or anything. But then she said lots of other things which at the time didn't make any sense at all.
What did she say? I'm dying to know.
Well, she said things like there's a new way of being and there's an issue that you've always known about but that you're not fully in integrity with. Instead, Spirit want you to take yourself off for a long walk in the countryside, talk to yourself, talk to Spirit and talk to nature, and they will show you what you need to see. But strangely, whether it's a coincidence or not, I really don't know. But it was around about the same sort of time, my gender dysphoria increased dramatically. It went through the roof. So much so that I didn't know what gender I was at all. I hadn't got a clue.
When you say you didn't know what gender you were, was that when you looked in the mirror? Did you see...
No, nothing to do with looking in the mirror. I just didn't know what gender I was. It's just how I felt. I just didn't know. I didn't know whether it was male, female, whether I was somewhere in between. I didn't know, and so I was so troubled by it that I was even typing into Google, "What gender is Martin Neeves?" Now I know that's crazy because the answer could only come from me. It couldn't come from anywhere else, particularly Google. But I was desperate, and it's what desperate people do. And the thing is, I couldn't tell my wife about my inner turmoil because I didn't want to stir up a hornet's nest unnecessarily if it turned out to be something nothing. But also, if I did tell her, it would lead to her to ask me questions, which at the time I just didn't have the answers to. I just didn't know what gender I was.
How did it feel, just for other people that may be feeling a similar sort of thing? Can you describe the feelings?
It was awful. I just couldn't think of anything else. It took over my whole life. I mean, my work suffered for it. I just couldn't do anything. It's job to describe. It just takes over every waking hour. It really does. It's awful. What I decided to do was to get some counselling. So I found a counsellor who had experience of dealing with people with gender issues. And I had 4 sessions with her. And in hindsight, I think I should have had more sessions because at the end of those sessions, I wrongly came to the conclusion that I was gender fluid. Now, would you like me to explain that?
Absolutely, because we've had a few there. I've got the gender dysmorphia now. Dysphoria even. But gender fluid, please.
Yeah,
and there are so many words going about at the moment. It's confusing, I think.
Okay, so let's go back to basics. So let's talk about sex. There's a song about that.
Let's talk about it. I love it.
So we'll talk about sex to begin with. So when we're born, we're all born just as babies. No surprise there. But we're born as babies with various bits. We have bits between our legs, bits between our ears, bits inside our bodies, bits on the ends of our arms and legs, bits everywhere.
Yes.
But the only bits that count in terms of your birth certificate are the bits between your legs or the appearance of them. And so the doctor or midwife looks between the legs, depending on what they see. In this country, they have a binary choice, boy or girl. That's all they can put down. In other countries, that's changing, and there's some countries there's not a requirement to actually put a sex of the baby now, which is great. But at the moment in this country, it's still just this binary choice, boy or girl. That's all they can put down. But the thing
Blue
about
or pink.
exactly, that's what it is. That's exactly what it is. But the thing about nature is it's very messy. It doesn't do binary things. It doesn't do black and white, boy, girl, pink, blue. It does a whole spectrum of things. And so so many people are what's called intersex, and so they can have a third chromosome. So it's not as straightforward as XX and XY chromosomes. You can actually have up to 5 chromosomes. And so a typical example of being intersex would be, they could have a vagina, but then they could have internal testes. But often those internal testes aren't found until much later in life when there's medical examinations done. So at the time, the doctor or midwife looks between the legs and they see a vagina, so the child gets put down as a girl. And this actually affects... It's just under 2% of the population, which is it's about the same number of people in this country who's got ginger hair. Not necessarily the same people, so don't go jumping to
Now
any
that's
conclusions.
interesting
It
nearly
is.
2%, because I was going
quite
to
a lot.
ask you, you know, when I say nowadays, I'd say over the past, and please correct me if I'm wrong, over the past sort of 5 years, it's become very topical. Maybe not topical, maybe the awareness is growing.
The awareness is growing.
And there are all these different words, like you say, and we've talked about a few, but then there's binary, non-binary.
I'll come on to that. I'm working my way up to it. So brace yourself. so but the thing is that we're talking just about the primary sex characteristics, but we're used to seeing a whole range of secondary sex characteristics. So, for instance, you think of the typical alpha male. They're over 6 foot. They're they're tall. They're broad. They've got big hands, big feet. You know what they say about men with big feet, big shoes.
Yes.
They've got a square jaw, protruding forehead.
Yeah.
Typical alpha male. But then not all men look like that. Some men are much shorter. They're more petite. They've got small hands, small feet. And then look at women. Not all
Same
women look like Barbie dolls.
No.
Many women look much more masculine. So there's a whole range, and we're used to seeing that. But that's just normal. We're okay with that. But it's just the same with the primary sex characteristics. But then that's just talking about sex. Gender is the sex of your brain, and it manifests itself in how you feel in your head and your heart, and you just know.
And that's the bit that hasn't been talked about, I guess,
exactly.
for the centuries, because we obviously see our sexual organs.
Yeah, exactly.
But what's up here, I guess, unless you have, I mean, I've never felt anything other than a woman. Sometimes I want to be a man and go punch somebody, but I've never had that feeling other than being a woman. So I think it could be quite difficult to understand what that means if you haven't had those feelings before.
Oh, absolutely. And for people who are not trans, they're called cisgender. So people who are not trans, the vast majority of people are lucky them, I say. So they just assume that they're 100% male or 100% female. But let's look at gender now. So the gender is the sex of your brain. So just as sex isn't binary, gender isn't binary either. There's a whole spectrum. And it's not linear either. So many people are what's called agender. So they don't have a gender at all. That's going to blow your mind, isn't it?
Gosh, I mean,
But just for simplicity purposes, for the time being, think of it as being linear, with 100% male at one end, 100% female at the other end. Nobody's 100% either. We're all somewhere on the spectrum. But say for most people who are cisgender, that they had no reason to look at where they are on the spectrum. But I reckon it's about 1% of the population are trans, and I think up to about 4% could be non-binary. So I'll explain all that. So the people that are roughly in the middle of this spectrum, they're non-binary, and they don't feel either male or female. They don't feel either, okay? But for gender fluid people, they're roughly in the middle, but sometimes they feel male and sometimes they feel female. And that can vary by the day, by the week, whatever. And all these things are perfectly normal, perfectly natural ways of being a human being. There's nothing wrong with human beings, but there's an awful lot wrong to do with this very restrictive binary labelling system that we're all forced to adopt. That it just gives too much sort of emphasis. It's emphasis on the sex and not ignoring gender completely. Many trans people decide not to transition because they've got so much to lose, and they're frightened of losing. And I totally respect them for that, and I totally get it. I really do. And I could have easily done that. I really could have done that, and it would have been an easier option. Certainly in the short term. I think in the long term, it would have caused some big problems to me. I think mentally, I think it would have done. And the research that I did showed that most trans people who decide to transition, because that's the only choice you have, is whether you decide to do anything about it or not. You don't have any choice whether you are trans. You either are trans or you're not. But say not all trans people transition. But the most people who decide to transition, after the initial loss, pain and heartache and bumpy journey along the way, usually go on to lead happy and contented lives. Whereas a lot of trans people who decide not to transition and to live their lives for other people, sadly they often end up in a spiral of depression or often worse. And so the urge to live my truth was just so overwhelmingly strong because I was finally at peace with myself. I knew who I was. I just had to do this thing.
So what was the biggest fear for you in all of this?
Well, my two biggest fears, one, losing my wife and my family, and my friends as well. And so I was losing all my loved ones, and also losing my business as well, because I was freelance photographer. I didn't know how my clients were going to react to that. I just didn't know. I was absolutely petrified, but I knew that it's something I had to do for me.
Were you ever fearful about society, how society would take you? Or,
Yeah.
Or,
Oh, absolutely.
Or,
Absolutely. It's petrified. Absolutely petrified. Nobody chooses to go down this route. It's such a hard journey. But it's something I had to do because I was finally at peace with myself, and admitting it to myself, that was such a relief. It really was.
So sitting here now, I mean, I see Katie here. Do you mind telling me where you are in that transition process?
Yeah. Well, what I decided to do, and what I had to do. So the first thing I had to do was then to tell my wife about this, and that was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Well, no, actually, the hardest thing was actually admitting it to myself, because I was trans. The next hardest thing was to tell my wife, and I was so frightened of doing it. It took me a whole month to block up courage to tell her, and I was so frightened that I actually wrote a letter to her just in case my words didn't come out right. And in the event my words did come out right, but I gave her the letter at the end so she had something to refer to, because it was such a bombshell that I dropped on her. And so, and I felt terrible for doing it. I really did. I hated myself for doing it, but I had to tell her, and I couldn't have told her sooner because I didn't know sooner. I didn't know. And I should point out that gender and sexuality are completely separate entities, and they're not linked. So in my case, I've always been attracted to women, and I still am. So it's been one of the constants in my life.
And I think that's one of these myths or not a myth, because people would your instant reaction would be, does that mean you're gay?
Well, I am, because I'm attracted to women.
Oh yes.
Yeah, I'm lesbian. Yeah.
So you're a lesbian, basically. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's happened is the label has changed for me. So previously I was labelled as a heterosexual man. Now I'm labelled as a lesbian. It feels no different to me. It feels as it always has done. But obviously for my wife then, that her label hadn't changed. She was still attracted to men. So there was a problem. There was a mismatch. And we tried counselling, but very sadly that didn't work out. So unfortunately that meant the end of my second marriage. So although we'd been together for a long time, the marriage was very short.
And what would you say to somebody that is out there and they're on this edge of, what am I? They're having the feelings that you had, and they are contemplating ending it all?
Well, I get contacted by quite a lot of people in that situation, just to let them know that they're not alone. That's the first thing. They're not alone. They're not the only person that feels like that. There are thousands and thousands of people in the same position, and that those feelings will pass. And living your truth is the key to happiness. It really is. And if you try and fight against it, that's when you're going to be unhappy. But the key to happiness is living your truth. And so what I did, I started, so I thought I've got to do some good with this. And so I started vlogging my whole journey. I thought I'll bring people along on the journey with me, make it accessible to people. To do two things. One is to reach out to other trans people to let them know that it's okay to be trans, because it is. And then the other thing is to show other people that trans people are just ordinary people who want to be happy. I think the key to this is education, because I think there's a lot of bigotry and prejudice comes from a fear of the unknown. So if you can educate people, you can take that fear away. So the more education there is, the more acceptance there'll be. Then the more acceptance there'll be, the easier it'll be for other trans people to A, admit to themselves they're trans, because that's the hardest thing, and B, actually do something about it.
And come out to the world.
Absolutely,
and come out to
absolutely. So I started telling a story and vlogging a story, and then my story was picked up initially by the local media, and I started doing interviews for local radio and local newspapers, and then it escalated, and I started doing national radio and television and national newspapers and magazines, and so all of a sudden I'd become this trans ambassador.
Just before we wrap this interview up, where can people find out about you or reach you? And are you open to talk to people that are going through struggles and maybe need to reach out?
Absolutely, yeah. I get contacted a lot by trans people, also parents of trans people as well, because they often struggle with it as well. So yeah, they often contact
me. Well, that's what I was actually thinking. If you are a parent of a child who's going through this, what advice would you give the parents?
Okay, well, for parents, then the best place for them to go to is a charity called Mermaids. It was a brilliant charity, and they help parents and children. So up to the age of about, I think it's 18 or might be 20 or 21, but certainly young people, they help them, and they're absolutely brilliant. They're a wonderful charity, they really are. But to contact me, they could either do it through any of the social media. I'm on the social media as Katie Neeves, or as Cool to Be Trans. So look me up there, or just go to my website, which is cooltobetrans.co.uk.
We'll put all that on the show notes as well.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people, so just remember it's the number 2 and the letter B in the middle of it, because a lot of people don't get
that.
But yeah, that's probably the best way to contact me. Yeah.
Well, Katie, look, it's been such an honour having you here on my show, and thank you for speaking your truth.
Oh, you're welcome, Sonya. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Hope you enjoyed the show. Remember, there's a new interview out every Monday, so hit subscribe and like, and you'll get it straight into your inbox.